Class. We're going to start week 13. And yes, my camera is working this week. Finally, I got it fixed yesterday, so I'm happy about that. But this week we'll focus on this idea of the continuum of employment options, essentially, for students with disabilities or youth with disabilities, and then also what kind of that employment development looks like. So with that, our learning intentions is I hope that after this week, um, the your readings and the videos and this lecture that you will be able to describe kind of what that continuum of employment looks like for students with disabilities. And also that you'll be able to find Utah resources so that you can help your students develop employment skills and paid employment before they leave school. So I think first and foremost that the ultimate goal really is to have students involved or leave school with competitive integrated employment. And so this is a term that we use frequently when we're talking about employment for individuals with disabilities. So I just want to be really clear about essentially what the law says and how it defines competitive integrated employment. So it is essentially full or part-time work for an individual, and they have to have at least earn minimum wage or higher. And they have to be able to receive the same level of benefits provided to other employees without disabilities in similar positions. And it also has to be in a location where they are interacting with other employees that do not have disabilities. And they have to have opportunities for advancement. So just like anyone else would, right? So that maybe you start a job in an entry-level position, but you have the ability to move into um, higher paying, but also higher positions, right? Like, so maybe you start off as a cashier and then you end up as a manager, right? So that's important because we don't want to have a student or an individual with a disability like stuck in their job forever, right? We want it to be kind of the same exact access as anyone else in the job market, where they can start in a job at an entry level and then kind of move up. So that is the actual definition of competitive integrative employment. And if you remember back to week 1, when I talked about our outcomes of students with disabilities that leave our schools in Utah, when we call them a year later to find out what level of employment they're engaged in, this is the measure that we use, is competitive integrated employment. So we ask questions of former students about the number of hours they work, if they earn minimum wage, are they employed in out in the community with people without disabilities, do they have opportunities for advancement? So that's the definition that we really use ultimately to really to measure our students with disability leaving our schools to see if they really truly are competitively integratedly employed. So just wanted to be really clear. And I think this is the ultimate. I mean, certainly not all students, I think, end up in a situation where they are in competitive integrated employment, but we kind of tend to call this the gold standard of transition outcomes, right? Like this is the ultimate. We want our students to be out in the community, working in jobs, earning more money, having opportunities, working with non-disabled peers so they can have those natural supports and social connections and all those things, everyone else sort of gets out of their work. So that's why it's so important. But we are going to talk about other types of employment as well. Again, so let's talk about, why is this standard so important? Well, we know that individuals with disabilities oftentimes are either underemployed or not employed at all, and that really impacts their quality of life. And so we know that students with disabilities are just individuals, adults with disabilities, have higher rates of poverty than the rest of the population, right? And some of that is due to the fact that they have barriers in employment, or maybe they are not earning minimum wage. They don't have opportunities for better jobs and more pay. So, that is why this is really the goal, is to have students be competitively integrated employment. And then it really contributes to a meaningful life. I think we talked about this before, right? Like so much of our connection and self-worth, and joy that we get out of life really is our connections at work and the work that we do and how we feel accomplished in that work. So it contributes to meaningful life. And it also, I think, contributes to less isolation and more community inclusion, right? So if folks with disabilities are not working in the community, they can be very isolated. And that is usually not a good thing, right? For many reasons, for mental health, for just not having social connections, those kinds of things. And then identity, I think all of us really, I know for me, like work is a huge part of my identity. It's not everything. There's other things that, I identify with being, a wife, a mother, all the leisure activities I enjoy, things like that. But it is a huge part of my identity, my work. And so we don't want to take that away from people with disabilities either. And then again, that connection, right? I think ultimately social connection and friendships is so important. And if we isolate individuals with disabilities in work settings, they're limited, I think, with connection. They may just be connecting with others with disabilities and not necessarily other people without disabilities or people that share their same interests or live in their neighborhood or in their communities. So this, I think, really kind of explains why competitive integrated employment really is, in my mind, the ultimate goal for our students with disabilities. But let's talk a little bit about, other types of employment, because I'm sure you've had experience with people with disabilities working in different settings. And we'll talk about, I think, the kind of pros and cons to those. So let's kind of start with what I see as probably not the best option is what's called sheltered work. So this is a situation where individuals with disabilities, are maybe bused or driven to a warehouse, for example, a sheltered workshop where they might be doing like piecework, right? Like they might be putting certain things together for a company, but it's kind of really rote work. They usually are only in this place with others with disabilities, supported oftentimes by staff, but they really have no connection to the greater community. And oftentimes they are working for much, much less than minimum wage, sometimes pennies on the dollar. And so really, this is not, in my mind, the best option for individuals with disabilities. And I think sometimes you'll see in the videos that there are definitely people that feel like there is a place for this and a need for this. But I would argue that it is a bit of a life sentence. I think sometimes when individuals with disabilities are placed into sheltered work, the agency that supports them might say, oh yeah, we're teaching them job skills and they'll eventually get a job out in the community. But I would say more often than not, they don't leave that sheltered workshop. So it kind of becomes that's it for them, right? Like they enter into that and they might stay there for their entire working life. In many states, this is outlawed. There in Maine and in Oregon, I think it was early 2000s, there were some pretty significant lawsuits where the Department of Justice came in and actually shut down these workshops and said that they were discriminatory and that they were really not lawful for people with disabilities to be kind of warehoused and be paid such low wages. And so that is not true of every state, but I can tell you in our state of Utah, we also have the Department of Justice come a few years ago and investigate. So there is sort of an investigation going on around this idea that our adults with disabilities in our state, especially our adults with significant disabilities, don't have options to get out of sheltered work. And so this is not resolved, this lawsuit in our state. It's kind of in the process of being kind of worked out. But it's definitely a concern. So we have sheltered workshops in Utah. I have to say the goal is to have less of them, and there are less individuals served this way now than there were, like, for example, 5 or 10 years ago, but they certainly are not closed in our state, just so that you know that. And then there's kind of this idea of like school-based enterprises or just even businesses that you might see popping up in your community that are essentially run just by individuals with disabilities. So here's an example. I live in Park City and there's a coffee place called Lucky Ones, right? And it is a coffee shop and it's attached to our library here in town. And some students from Park City High School work there and other individuals with disabilities. But all the people that work there are people that have disabilities. And then there is like a supervisor manager that doesn't have disabilities. And yes, that you could argue, yes, they're out in the community. They're having contact with customers, like, that's certainly in my mind better than being in a sheltered work. However, I think we just have to kind of be careful because they're not working amongst others without disabilities. And then the other piece of that is you see this a lot in schools where they'll kind of start a business like a coffee cart and they'll go around to classrooms or the faculty room and sell coffee um, and learning some job skills. But I guess what worries me about this is, not all students with disabilities want to serve coffee, right? So like if it matches that student's interests and their skills and, their preferences, then, by all means, that might be a great option for them. But not every student with a disability wants to make and serve coffee, right? Like we know people are so varied, and they have different talents, and we should be exploring employment that matches their skill set and their interests and their disabilities. Their abilities. So I'm not a huge fan of these school-based enterprises. I think it's okay to explore, but I just hesitate that, all students with disabilities should be doing that kind of a thing because, they have so many different interests. So that's sort of the idea behind school-based enterprises. What I'm a huge fan of, I must say, is this concept called customized employment. And what that is it's just not a traditional way to get a job, right? So let's say you have a student with a pretty complex need and they want to work at a retail store, right? But they're not going to go on Indeed.com and fill out a resume and do kind of a typical interview that anyone else would do at a retail store because maybe they can't run a register and maybe they can't do all of those job tasks. But they're really interested in working in retail because they love fashion, let's say. Customized employment, we used to call it job carving. So it is essentially a job that is it's very specific, I think, to the individual's interests and preferences and their skill set and a need that the employer has. So I'll give you an example. I had a student who also really wanted to work in a retail clothing store, but didn't have the skills to like count money at that time. Maybe she would gain the skills later, but at that time, she didn't have the skills to run a register or really to effectively necessarily communicate with customers. So she couldn't do all of the job tasks that were associated with a typical person that would work in this clothing store. So I approached the employer and said, she's really interested in working here. And I've noticed that the clothes are piling up after people try them on in the dressing rooms and they're not getting put back. What if she came in every day for a couple of hours and just put all the clothes from the dressing rooms back on the racks? And these were all organized by color, right? So that like she could do that. And I said that way it would free your other employees up to do all those other important things like tagging new clothes that come in and assisting customers and running the register and whatever else, inventory, those kinds of things. So, he saw the value in that. And she was quite good at organizing and putting all those clothes away from the dressing room. And that freed up his employees to do those other important things. So that's an example of customized employment so we sort of carved out a couple of tasks within that employment setting. And it was a consignment retail clothing store. And it worked great, right? Like the employer was happy, my student was happy. They were in the setting they wanted to be in. They were motivated. They made friends. They connection. She was successful at her job. She was getting paid. So that to me is kind of like my favorite approach to employment, especially for students with more complex needs that aren't probably going to be employed in a real typical way, right? So I love customized employment. Then there's also self-employment. So another example of that might be sometimes you go to businesses and you'll see candy machines. It could be that an individual, with a disability buys a whole bunch of candy machines and goes out in the community and places those in different businesses and then fills those up, right? Like every couple of days or every week or whatever the case may be. So that's an example of self-employment. Other things are, a cookie business, like baking cookies at home and then selling them in local coffee shops, right? So they'd have to go out in the community and take inventory and stock of how many cookies that coffee shop might need, and then they bake them at home. And so, those are kind of examples of self-employment. And I think sometimes that's a great fit for individuals. I think especially individuals that, for some reason maybe have a lot of anxiety or, just have trouble maybe moving around the community, whatever the case may be, right? There's always, I think, reasons that self-employment is a good choice. It requires definitely some support, I think, from families to really pull this off. But I've seen it done very successfully. So that's an option. And then we just talked about competitive integrated employment. I think for most individuals with disabilities, that is probably the goal. But I think students that have more extensive support needs, we might want to look at these other options. And then there is supported employment. And that essentially is kind of a traditional way of getting a job. But the individual needs some support, and that is usually in the form of job coaching, right? So I've had students that, just needed that extra person to kind of, keep them on task and making sure that they were following their checklists at a job. And so that job coach would come in, or they would also communicate with the employer to make sure that they were training the individual appropriately. Now, sometimes I think the ultimate goal with supported employment, job coaching, is to fade that coach away, right? In some cases, we might not be able to do that, but ideally, if we start with job coaching, at least I did this with my students, I was always trying to fade out. So maybe I would I would get them started and then I would leave, or I would go, leave for a few minutes, 20 minutes or so, and then come back and check in on them. I would actually like spy. I had students at Walmart and Smith's, and I wanted to see how they would do without my support. And I would also train the employees to provide natural support. So what that means is, kind of giving other employees and the permission and the skills to say, my student needs some support, but they don't need me by their side all the time, right? But maybe you could help by giving them some reminders or telling them when their break, they can take their break, telling them when their break is over, because I had students that couldn't read a clock, right? So they didn't understand when to take a break and when to end their break. And so those natural supports on the job, it could just be another employee, would essentially support them. So that's another form of supported employment. But I think the goal with this is to always try to fade that job coaching as much as possible. And then there's like kind of this whole slew of work-based learning experiences, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But this ideally is something we want to be doing while the student is in school. Internships, job shadows, whether they're paid or unpaid internship, apprenticeships, informational interviews. So any kind of learning they can do that is directly at a workplace or with people that are in that workplace setting. So not simulated, not, trying to set up a simulated thing in your classroom, but these are authentic work experiences. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. So again, I just wanted to kind of give you the definition of customized employment because I'm a big fan. And those of you that are working with students with more complex needs, I really hope that you kind of understand this, because I think, especially talking to parents, and I, spent a lot of time working with parents, if you'd mentioned work, they just couldn't imagine it for their individual, for their child, because their child had complex needs and they just didn't know what work was going to look like. And so customized employment is really this process that focuses on creating this personalized employment. Again, that job carving and the relationship between what can the job seeker, do well, and what are they interested in, where are they at their best, and what are the employer needs, and it's matching that. So it really takes a job developer, and that could be a teacher, or that could be a provider, that could be, somebody that is working to support that individual to really kind of know their unique needs and strengths of both parties, right? What does the employer need? What can the individual really offer? And then how can we make that this kind of like specialized, customized job really work? And when it's done well, it's a beautiful thing, I have to say. So I do want to mention kind of some things around the law. So that definition of competitive integrated employment actually comes straight out of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, also known as WIOA. Sometimes people call it WIOA. But this kind of got reauthorized in 2014. What I mean by that is the Workforce Innovation Act was there before, but then they renamed it to the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, and they really included language around youth with disabilities, right? To break down the barriers, because we know that people with disabilities are underemployed. And essentially there's a lot in the law, but what I really want to point out is that there are mandates that say students, youth with disabilities cannot be funneled directly from schools into sheltered work. And that was happening a lot. So for example, students would be in post-high program or in a school special education program, and then the personnel at that school would have like a direct connection to the sheltered workshop in the community, and they would just kind of funnel the students straight into sheltered work without considering all those other options we just talked about, without looking at customized employment or self-employment or internships. Well, that's not allowed anymore. So what has to happen is there has to be proof that that student has had access to pre-employment transition services. So that means they have to have had some access, some instruction, some experiences with career awareness, career development, job shadowing, workplace readiness, sort of like soft skills, social, all those things that we, want to give students to get them ready for work. That now actually has to be documented before a youth can ever enter a sheltered work environment. So, in my mind, this is a good thing, right? So we kind of have these stopgap measures, I guess you could say, that prevent our students to just automatically go into sheltered work, right? We have to provide them these opportunities, this instruction, and that is typically done through our vocational rehabilitation providers. Remember, pre-ETS is essentially under VR. It's paid by VR. There are contracted providers, there are instructors, VR counselors can provide pre-ETS, but that has to happen first. So this is another reason I think why it's so important that we connect our students with pre-ETS and VR services while they're in school. So we are already kind of giving them all of these instruction and supports around pre-employment transition services. Like we're exploring their interests, we're putting them out in different environments to see what's a good match, like all of this stuff we want to be doing before a student leaves school, in hopes that they don't end up having to be in sheltered work and that they have a lot more opportunities and choices and skill development to lead to successful employment. And this is why we have to start early, right? And this is why we have to collaborate. It definitely is not something that you as a teacher could take on all yourselves. But I want you to be aware that is in place. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about development of employment. Like, what does that look like? When do we start? Well, we can start pretty early, right? Like, what I mean by that is definitely 14, maybe even earlier. Even elementary schools, middle schools, they don't necessarily have job fairs, but they have guest speakers coming in. They have tours at different businesses. They have STEM fairs. Anything I think that really exposes our students to work. So making sure if those activities are happening in your setting, in your school, that your students are not excluded from those. Let's make sure they're included. They might need supports, they might need some modifications, but that is super important. So think of development of employment as like, it's a process, right? And it's progressive. So let's start with first and foremost having really a deep dive into their interests through career interest inventories. Once we kind of identify what they're interested in, let's say it's the medical field, or maybe it's around animals, then the next step might be this first one here, informational interviews. So what that is when a student actually interviews somebody in that field. So whether they come into the classroom or whether, you take students out or somebody is taking students out to that business, we want students to have some good questions to ask, right? And that is called an informational interview, where they prepare questions and interview an employee. I hyperlinked this checklist because I just found this actually. Vocational rehabilitation has an informational interview checklist. It's not the only one out there. You could probably Google a whole bunch more, but it is one from Utah, from our vocational rehabilitation partners. So it's a great activity. I think once you get students to do some career exploration and they sort of figure out areas that they might be interested in, try to set this up or have your pre-ETS provider do that. Or if you have connections with local employers, bring them in but have students prepared so they're not just, have nothing to say to them. So you might want to like practice this in your classroom before they actually interview an employee in an area of their interest. So that's what that is. Job shadowing is a little bit different. That it might be the next step where you take a student or maybe a very small group of students. I wouldn't do like a huge field trip. We don't want to overwhelm businesses, but one or two students that might be super interested in like, what is it like to be a vet or a vet tech, right? If you have a local vet office in your community, set up a job shadow where they come in for an hour, 2 hours, depending upon kind of the student's attention span. They follow around that vet tech for a while and see what that actually looks like. Maybe they love animals, but then when it comes to watching them, a vet tech give shots to an animal, that might really freak them out, right? So that maybe then they learn what they would like and what they can't tolerate. So job shadowing is a really, really great activity to do with students. Internships are a little different. I think, those usually come into play when a student's a little bit older. They can be paid or unpaid. They usually last typically about 3 months, where the student might go a couple of days of work a week into a business, either during school hours if they're getting credit, or maybe it's happening after school. And they do an internship. So, they're actually at that business doing some tasks. And it's a great way to kind of figure out whether the student likes that. Apprenticeships are a little different. They're more intense. Those are usually like in the trade field. So things like plumbing, electrician, where they might be taking a set of courses along with it, like a certification program, and then they're set up with an employer. And those are typically full-time. They're pretty involved internships. I'm sorry, apprenticeships, and usually for older student, but also really, really worthwhile, right? I feel like apprenticeships are kind of like we those were really popular, like, I don't know, probably 50 or 100 years ago, but they're coming back. There's a pretty big emphasis in our state right now on apprenticeships. And then there's on-the-job training, right? Like we can only do so much to train students or get them ready for employment outside of the actual setting. So much of what you learn is on the job, right? So whether that be with a formal coach or whether that just be a natural supports, or the employer might have an actual training program or a mentorship type of a situation. So that's what on-the-job training is. And then we also kind of have these other concepts that are called service learning or volunteering. And I think we have to be really careful that we don't put students with disabilities in businesses where they're doing work-based learning and then call it volunteering, right? So what we don't want to do is say to a business, oh, I have a student with a disability, they can do XYZ and they'll do it for free. There's actually laws around that. We can have students that do internships non-paid a certain amount of hours if it aligns with their IEP. But what we don't want to do is say, oh, we have, free employment because this person has a disability, or a free labor, essentially. So I think the things to keep in mind I think service learning and volunteering are valuable, but we have to look at those as not, free labor. So an example, I took my students to the food bank, usually once a month, and that was service learning or volunteering, and they gained some valuable skills there. But that is, a lot of people volunteer at the food bank, right? People without disabilities. So this was truly a volunteer situation. This was not in place or instead of internships or work-based learning experiences. So I think they're worthwhile. We just have to be careful how we set those up, and that we never say that the student is volunteering at a paid business, because that shouldn't be the case. They could be volunteering at a nonprofit, right? Or some other kind of organization or group that's going on in the community. So I wanted to make that clear. All right, I know this is totally hard to see, but I will link this on the Canvas page. So pre-employment transition services, and I know we've talked about that before. There are those 5 core services across the top. They're job exploration, workplace readiness, self-advocacy, counseling on post-secondary, and then work-based learning experiences and activities. What this is essentially is a timeline. So the top left-hand box that's red, that's for young students. That says 14 to 15. And then all the way at the bottom where there's the green graduation cap, those are older students 18 to 20. So this is essentially kind of an activity guide to show that this is a process. We want to start talking about employment early and what would be appropriate. We wouldn't take a 14-year-old and put him in an apprenticeship yet, right? But we would start working on interviewing skills, filling out job applications, communication practice, job readiness kinds of activities. We might be doing a lot of career interest inventories with a 14-year-old. So the idea is that we're sort of stacking these career development activities and instruction for a student. So we want to start early. We want to introduce them to the world of work, and we want to kind of get them to have lots of experiences out in the community, seeing businesses, or even through videos. There's some, great videos now where they can really explore careers, and then constantly kind of be adding those activities so that the student gets ready for actual work, right? So it is definitely a process. So we want to do things like there are things like disability mentoring days that happen in our state. So there are businesses that sponsor these mentoring days. And they happen several times a year, and students usually go with their teachers and other peers, and they go visit these businesses, and they get to kind of see what the world of work is like and what employers are looking for, how to dress for work, how to prepare a resume, all those kinds of things. So this activity guide is available on the vocational rehabilitation website, and I have it linked on the next slide with a bunch of other resources. So check it out, especially if you're working with younger students and you're like, well, how do I prepare them for work? What do I do now, right? This activity guide can, I think, be a helpful tool and a place to start really thinking about, well, how do I, what are things I can do in school to get students ready? And then how do we then move them out into the community to authentic work situations and settings? So that's what that is. I wanted to leave you with a bunch of Utah resources. So a few years back, I was involved in a 5-year grant project called School to Work. And this was focused on students with more complex needs. And it was trying to prevent those students from leaving school without paid work, and also trying to prevent them from going into sheltered work. So this grant project was really focused on how do we really get students in paid employment before they leave? And these were students with some pretty complex needs. And so that link goes to a Padlet, which has kind of a whole step-by-step guide as to how do we kind of implement this idea of customized employment for students with more complex needs. So that's what the Utah School to Work Kit is all about. The next one, Able and Ready, that is a web page that was put together by the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council. And that council supports all individuals in our state with developmental disabilities. So autism, intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities. And it has kind of this portal, one for employees and one for job seekers. And I think it helps families really kind of navigate what could work look like for my student with a complex need or developmental disability, and who do I need to reach out to, and who can support my student? So that's what Able and Ready is. Check that out too, and share it with parents. I think anytime we can, I think, share information with parents so that they have high expectations and they know that work is possible, even if they think that their student has so many barriers to employment, right? Work's possible and they have the whole rest of their life ahead of them. So we don't want to write work off ever. I do want to mention a lot of times parents are super concerned that if their student is receiving benefits, so what I mean by that is supplemental security income, also known as SSI, that they will lose their SSI if they enter into work. This was a huge concern with the parents that I had because they had worked so hard to finally get a little bit of supplemental security income for their student. And then they were so fearful of that going away if the student started to work. There are lots of work incentives for people on benefits. So what I mean by that is people that are receiving benefits, especially if they're students, can work and not lose any of their benefits. We also have what's called benefits planners in our state, and they are a free service under vocational rehabilitation, and they are people that are experts in kind of figuring out how people can keep their benefits and work, right? So they can make more money, but still receive that supplemental income. And they'll sit down with a parent and a student and actually look at, how much money they're getting from SSI, what they might be earning, what would be the ideal amount of hours for them to work to not lose their benefits and their Medicaid, things like that. So benefits planning is super important. If you have parents saying, oh, I don't want my student working because they're going to lose their benefits, that is not true. They just need to be informed and really meet with a benefits planner. And you can be the connection to that. It's all on the VR vocational rehabilitation website. If they're connected with a VR counselor, like I said, that is a free service. But really, just because an individual is receiving benefits, it should not be an automatic, oh, they're not going to work, they can't work because they're receiving benefits. There's lots of incentives and ways that they can keep both, especially if they're students still in a program. Okay, I've linked vocational rehabilitation. I know we've talked a lot about that, but there's that link again to kind of all the services they provide for students, how to apply, where the local offices are. That's all on that VR link. And then students with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities that are either in services with DSPD or maybe thinking about applying for services from DSPD, Division of Services for People with Disabilities. They have a page called Employment Preparation Services. So again, if this is usually for individuals with more complex needs, but they have a whole page on employment because employment is a priority, right? But sometimes it's tricky, I think, for our students with more barriers. So that is what that link is. And then that pre-S activity guide that I just showed you last slide, that was really hard to see because the print was so small. That's the second to bottom link there. So that's a great tool. Check that out. And then to understand more about customized employment, that job carving that I talked a lot about, it's often called discovery because we go through a process of discovering what unique talents a student has, and then we match that with this process called customized employment. So if you want to just dive into that a little bit more and learn more about it, I think it's a great idea so that you can talk to parents about it, because a lot of parents haven't heard of this approach at all, customized employment. So I think the more you know, the more you can share with parents and and your colleagues, and I think the IEP team, that this is possible, right? We don't want to write anyone off around work, because work's important and they have the rest of their lives. And we certainly don't want to say that a student is never going to work. So check that link out. That is it for this week. I hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you next week.